right, welcome back to World War II history. We are going to talk about Germany triumphant this module number 2, and we will be on slide number 2. And hopefully you're following along with the slides. But before we do that, I wanted to kind of do a little bit of a knowledge check with you, and I wanted to give you an example of this. Have you take a look at this. This is a German newspaper called the Völkischer Beobachter, and it's dated, let's see here if I can make that out, 16 July 1941. Primary, secondary source, which do you think? It's definitely a primary source. The Völkischer Beobachter was a Nazi newspaper. Völkischer Beobachter in English means People's Observer, and it had a 24-year span. It was the official public face of the Nazi Party. It was a key instrument for propaganda for Hitler, and he ended up getting full rights to the newspaper, and it went from a monthly circulation to a daily circulation, more than 1 million readers by 1944. And so that would definitely be an example of a primary source. Here's another example of a primary source. This is a French phrase book that was given to American soldiers prior to going to France, or prior to D-Day, and this is dated September of 1943. How about this? Hitler, A Study in Tyranny by Alan Bullock. Primary, secondary source. Well, if you said secondary source, then you are definitely correct. It is a secondary source, written after World War II. About Adolf Hitler. Okay, slide number 2. We take a look at the map of Europe right now, and we see a few things have taken place. Number 1, Hitler placed troops in the Rhineland in 1936, and of course that violated the Treaty of Versailles. Number 2, he annexes Austria in March of 1938, known as the Anschluss. Number 3, he occupies the Sudetenland in 1939 because of the Munich Agreement. And number 4, he takes over Czechoslovakia, case Green. Number 5, he brokers Western Poland with Stalin, partitioning up Poland. If Stalin will agree to help him conquer Poland as part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, then Hitler will agree to allow Stalin to take some territories, and we'll talk about this in a minute, in Eastern Europe. Slide 3. So, in the book Mein Kampf, Hitler's book that he wrote while he was in Landsberg jail, he spoke of alliances, and it was his desire to form an alliance with England and Italy to keep France from encroaching upon German territory. And of course, his invasion of Czechoslovakia in March of 1939 certainly didn't endear him to Chamberlain, and once he invaded Poland, both England and France were bound by the Locarno Treaty, a mutual agreement to declare war on Germany. Therefore, in the days preceding the German invasion of Poland, both France and England appealed to Russia to join them in protecting Poland. But their lethargy in reaching a negotiation only irritated Stalin. And so, with an alliance with England out of the question, Hitler then looked toward a most unlikely source, Stalin. Next slide. Part of the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, also known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, gave Stalin a 100-mile cushion of Polish territory once he invaded Poland on September the 17th, 1939. And Stokesbury, the author of your textbook, agrees or argues on page 66 that without that 100-mile cushion, the German invasion of Russia, which happens on June the 22nd, 1941, might have succeeded. Ironically, the very deal that enabled Hitler to defeat Poland ended up costing him the war in the long run. Next slide. On August the 24th, 1939, just 8 days before he invades Poland, Hitler's foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, and V.M. Molotov signed this neutrality pact, known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Next slide. According to this agreement, Russia would get control over Latvia, Estonia, and Finland, while Germany would get control over Lithuania and Danzig. Poland would be partitioned into 3 major areas. Next slide. Stalin, alarmed at Hitler's success, decided he needed more than a 100-mile cushion of Polish territory that Hitler gave him as part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and therefore Stalin signed a mutual defense treaty with 3 Baltic republics, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And Stalin, after he does this, he immediately moves troops into these areas for security and as an extra layer of defense for his Russian borders in the event Germany would change her mind, which she does. Slide 8. Stalin also began to look at Finland and figured her for a potential German ally should Hitler decide to break his alliance with Russia. Additionally, Stalin wanted control of the Baltic Sea, and the only way he could have it is if he controlled Finland. Now, there were 2 significant events which increased Stalin's suspicions that Finland may decide to join Nazi Germany. First, there was the Anschluss. Hitler's annexation of Austria was seen by Stalin as a clear warning of future trouble from a dictator hungry for Lebensraum. Now remember that word Lebensraum. We defined that last time, and that, of course, that means living space. And then secondly, a German military delegation had arrived in Finland to help them celebrate their 20-year victory over communism. So Stalin viewed that as sympathy for the Finns, and as a result, Stalin issues an ultimatum to Finland, which essentially forces Finland to decide whether they're going to remain neutral or fight. He also used, Stalin, propaganda to increase diplomatic pressure. Slide number 9. In a similar agreement made with the Baltic states, Russia demanded pro-German Finland give up territory and the port of Murmansk. In October of 1939, Stalin offered to trade this barren tundra in the far north for the crucial Karelian Isthmus. The Karelian Isthmus, and on November the 26th of 39, the Finns, led by Marshal Karl Mannerheim, rejected Stalin's bargain and prepared for war. And while Finland held no hopes that they could actually win a full-blown war with the mighty Soviet Union, they hoped they could at least hold out long enough to gain Western sympathy and assistance. Slide number 10. Similar to what Hitler did to Poland just prior to the invasion, on November the 26th, 1939, and if you look at the next slide, the Soviets faked the Finnish shelling of the Russian town of Mainala. And in the aftermath, they demanded that the Finns apologize and withdraw their forces 25 kilometers from the border. And so this was a classic false flag operation, and it gave Stalin the casus belli, or the justification, if you will, to invade Finland. Next slide. The initial order of battle for the Soviets would involve around 30 infantry divisions and 8 tank brigades, about 1 million men. In the south, the Russian 7th Army, which would be led by General Kirill Meretskov, would cross the border on the Karelian Isthmus between Lake Ladoga and the Gulf of Finland, and would seize the vital city of Vyborg. On the right flank of Lake Ladoga, and you can look at the map here if you want, the Russian 8th Army was to swing around and drive for the Finnish lakes, effectively cutting off the Karelian Isthmus from the rest of the northern part of Finland. And in the center was sort of the waist, or the narrowest portion of Finland. The 9th Soviet Army was ordered to drive straight to the port city of Oulu, cutting Finland in half. So it's easy to remember, 7th, 8th, 9th, the 3 Soviet armies. Around 1 million Russian men would simultaneously cross the border after a lengthy artillery bombardment. And if all went well, the Russian attack would politically destabilize Finland by installing an internal puppet government that was comprised of patriotic Finnish communists. However, the bombing of numerous civilians in the capital of Helsinki aroused international anger, and it solidified the Finns' resistance, including Finnish communists. And so rather than coming out to welcome their Russian liberators, all of Finland rallied to fight the Soviets. Next slide. So, on November the 30th, 1939, the Winter War as it was called, begins. Russia attacked Finland. They crossed the Karelian Isthmus, pitting about 1 million Russian soldiers against 300,000 Finns. And as hardy as the Russian soldier was, the extreme cold temperatures proved to be disastrous for the Soviet army. Temperatures reached below 30 degrees Fahrenheit in December, and the Finns were able to inflict several humiliating defeats against a fully mechanized Soviet army. And the reason that they could do this was the Finns used guerrilla-style warfare tactics as well as innovation to batter the Russians. Next slide. And in what would become the turning point of the Winter War, 2 complete Soviet divisions, the 163rd and the 44th, were completely annihilated near a village called Sulsami. Next slide. By February, the Russians had reevaluated. They had purged many of their incompetent leaders, and a massive reformation was underway in the Soviet Red Army, led by General Semyon Timoshenko. The Russians adjusted their strategy. They launched a fresh attack against the Finnish lines, and after losing a great deal of men, Russian tanks and troops finally broke the Finns' resistance, and the conflict ended on March the 12th, 1940, with the signing of an armistice. Next slide. An unfortunate byproduct of the Winter War for Russia was that now Hitler looked at Russia in a different light. I mean, if a tiny nation like Finland could inflict such damage on the Red Army, Hitler's Wehrmacht could also. And within 15 months, Hitler would do just that by invading the Soviet Union. So let's look at a little bit at the Winter War in retrospect. First, it's been compared to a David versus Goliath matchup. The League of Nations deemed the Russian invasion as illegal and expelled them in December of 1939. The Finns would earn worldwide respect for their conduct. Soviets were embarrassed due to a lackluster performance. And this, of course, revealed huge mistakes that Stalin had made when he purged a lot of his top officers from 1934 to 1937. Also, the first use of a device known as the Molotov cocktail was an improvised incendiary device was used in the Winter War. Temperatures reached well below 30 degrees Fahrenheit, 30 degrees below zero, I should say. And the Winter War was the classic example of a light, well-trained, and hardened force bludgeoning a modern mechanized force. Next slide. On February the 16th, 1940, British sailors from a destroyer decided to board a German merchant vessel named the Altmark, and this vessel was in Norwegian waters. When they did this, they rescued about 300 British sailors who were prisoners on board. And although the British technically violated the laws of Norwegian neutrality, there was not a whole lot the Norwegians could do since they had missed searching for the prisoners during a search of the vessel. Next slide. And this incident so convinced Hitler that the British would soon try to occupy Scandinavia that he launched what is known as Operation Weserübung, or Operation Weser, in the early spring of 1940. This would be the largest German operation to date of the war, and it would involve the German Navy, Kriegsmarine, the German Army, the Heer, and the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe. Another reason Hitler wanted Norway was for the same reason the Allies wanted it, and that was for the iron ore. Next slide. Hitler, he fantasized about the Nordic heritage of the Aryan race, the Nordic legends of his ancestors, which is another reason that he stationed so many troops in Norway after he took Norway. On April the 9th, 1940, Hitler took Denmark, he invaded Norway, and after some heavy fighting, the King of Norway and his ministers escaped to Berlin to keep the Norwegian government intact. And in early June of that year, the Allies were evacuated. And like Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Denmark, Norway was now in Nazi hands. Next slide. In retrospect, the Norwegian campaign made fools of the British. Britain's Navy suffered some really serious setbacks at the hands of the Luftwaffe, and Neville Chamberlain resigned, which proved to be a good thing for the Brits. And on a positive note, Sir Winston Churchill stepped up to become the Prime Minister. And for the rest of the war, he was the Prime Minister. Hitler stationed substantial forces in Norway, which I already mentioned, which ironically prevented them from being used during the D-Day landings. And I would say that was definitely the providence of God in that. And when this happened, when Norway was taken, it finally got the attention of the Allies, the full attention. Next slide. As Operation Weser was wrapping up, on May the 10th, 1940, Fall Gelb, it's a German word and it means case yellow or Operation Yellow. Remember, the Germans like to color code their operations. Case white, Poland. Case green, Czechoslovakia. Case yellow is going to be the invasion of Western Europe, particularly what was called the Low Countries. Fall Gelb was the initial spearhead attack on Western Europe, with the final target to be being Paris. Now, Fall Gelb included the Low Countries. That was the first place that Hitler hit. And they were the Low Countries of Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg. And they were called Low Countries because they were below sea level. And Fall Gelb, or Case Yellow, is considered one of the world's greatest military masterpieces. Next slide. The French and British decided to advance into Belgium and Holland the moment German troops violated their neutrality. The agreement was to advance as far as if you're looking at the slide, there's this thin red line you'll see, and that's called the Dyle line, D-Y-L-E, and that extended from Antwerp to Namur. So the French and British, that was their plan, to go that far in the event of a German invasion, a German attack. Now, materialistically, the Allies outnumbered the Germans in men and tanks. Only in aircraft were the Germans numerically superior. Next slide. When Hitler launched Fall Gelb, Case Yellow, in the spring of 1940, the French and British had about 4,204 tanks compared to only 2,582 German tanks. In only 3 days of combat against French tanks in May of 1940, the 3rd and 4th German Panzer Divisions lost 25% of their tanks. So given these statistics, one wonders how the Germans were able to defeat the Western Allies so quickly. When it came to their tanks, the German Panzerwaffe, what the Germans lacked in quality, they made up for in utility. Remember the book that I showed you last time, Truppenführung, written in 1933, it contains an entire section devoted to armored fighting vehicles. In fact, specific instructions address attacking in deeply echelon formations, moving at maximum speed, and using the supporting elements of aircraft and infantry. This is classic Bewegungskrieg. And Commander-in-Chief of the German Army, a man by the name of Walter von Brauchitsch, ordered the immediate implementation of this doctrine as early as 1938. Now, in addition to Bewegungskrieg, there was another catalyst which kind of helps explain the seeming invincibility of the Wehrmacht in 1940. Interestingly, on 17 April 1940, just a few weeks really before the invasion of Western Europe, an official stimulant decree was issued, and the Wehrmacht ordered approximately 35 million of these tablets. And you can see this. I'll bring it as close as I can. Pervitin. Pervitin. This is an actual container, glass container, little vial, and inside of this contained about 30 Pervitin tablets. They're not there now. This is empty, as you can kind of see there. So Pervitin. The Wehrmacht ordered 35 million of these pills for the planned campaign in the West. Now, Pervitin was invented in 1937 by the Temmler Chemical Company in Germany. And Pervitin was a methamphetamine. It was crack, if you will. And these German soldiers would take these tablets, and it would allow them to remain alert for as long as 17 days in some instances without taking any kind of a break. And so, you may have heard this before, but when the Germans invaded Western Europe, they were high. they were completely under the influence of methamphetamines. And so, in fact, the German military became the first ever to rely upon crystal meth to give its soldiers that extra energy boost. 2 nights before the start of Fall Gelb, the German methamphetamine Pervitin was issued to all German troops, and it was consumed en masse. And of course the results were significant. Belgian troops were completely taken aback by the fearless behavior of German troops and promptly retreated. Next slide. The second stage of the operation was codenamed Fall Rot, or Case Red. And this was, of course, the approach into Paris. And although the plan underwent a total of 4 modifications, it settled upon calling for 3 German army groups led by General von Bock, General von Rundstedt, and General von Leb driving to the Meuse River. Now the French based their operational plan to meet the German attack on 4 assumptions. Number 1, the assumption that the Maginot Line was impregnable. Number 2, that the Ardennes Forest was impassable for German tanks. Number 3, the French would need to advance into Belgium and Holland once hostilities commenced. And number 4, the assumption on the French that the Germans would just simply replay the Schlieffen Plan that they used in the Great War. Next slide. The Schlieffen Plan was the German military's response to the Franco-Prussian alliance of 1892. Named after Count Alfred Graf von Schlieffen, the plan basically involved Germany's strategy to deliver this rapid knockout blow against the French army in the event hostilities erupted in Europe during the opening days of the Great War. Next slide. Considered one of the best military strategists of World War II, German Field Marshal Erich von Manstein actually convinced Hitler not to replay the Schlieffen Plan. Instead, Manstein argued that the thrust of the attack should be like a sickle stroke, straight through the Ardennes Forest. This is what nobody expected, and this would, of course, trap the Allies at the channel ports of France. Manstein, his plan came to be known as Operation Sickelschnitt, which is German for sickle stroke. And one reason Manstein's plan was really genius was because the Allies expected the Germans to do the exact opposite and follow what they did in the Great War, which was the Schlieffen Plan. Next slide. So, Case Yellow, Fall Gelb, commenced during the early hours of May the 10th, 1940, and the objective of this operation was to encircle the Dutch and Belgian armies and pin the British and French against the English Channel. And this is exactly what happened. As German troops were more organized, and of course they were hopped up on methamphetamine, while the Allies were in a completely defensive mode. They had a weak chain of command and generally lacked the enthusiasm for war. Next slide. Holland was gone in just 4 days. Belgium held out until May the 27th. And in one of the most daring and spectacular moments of Fall Gelb, German Kurt Studen's 7th Flieger Battalion of Luftwaffe paratroopers, known as Fallschirmjägers, landed on top of a supposedly impregnable Belgian fort named Eben Emael, and they captured it in 24 hours. The speed with which Hitler had smashed through the Low Countries truly astonished the Allies, and frankly they were unprepared for it. By May the 13th, 1940, the Germans were at the Meuse River, the main French defense line, and on May the 21st, the Germans reached the sea at Abbeville and effectively cut off all the northern Allied armies. Next slide. And in desperation, Lord John Gort, the commander of the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, ordered all British troops to the port of Dunkirk for this massive evacuation. And of course, this is Operation Dynamo. Operation Dynamo. Beginning on May the 27th, the Allies used every kind of vessel you could imagine to get men from the British Army off the port of Dunkirk and back across the Channel to England. Next slide. With Britain essentially out of it now, France stood alone. They had lost 24 of their 27 infantry divisions and half of their armored divisions, and within 3 weeks France would capitulate, they would surrender, and they would endure 4 hard, long years of German occupation. Next slide. After the fall of France, the country's political infrastructure became three Frances, in a sense. The northern part of France was occupied entirely by the Germans. Southern France, called Vichy France, became just a puppet government with Marshal Pétain in charge, a Frenchman who was basically doing whatever the Nazis wanted. And then there was Free France, was a highly effective, organized resistance movement commanded by General Charles de Gaulle, who was in England, who had fled to England for safety. And the French resistance was very successful in the days leading up to the Normandy invasions and even after that. Next slide. Take a drink of water. I'm doing so much talking, and none of you are doing any talking. So, as Hitler sat triumphant in France, the Germans misjudged the British resolve and believed the war was pretty much over. In fact, Hitler was so confident of this that he went on vacation in Paris as he waited for the British to ask for peace. General Alfred Jodl, German General Alfred Jodl, however, suggested to Hitler the strategic possibility of delivering a final knockout blow to the British and end the war once and for all. And this involved a direct amphibious attack on the English, using all realms of the Wehrmacht. And the preliminary plans for this were called Operation Sea Lion. Operation Sea Lion. Again, an amphibious invasion of Great Britain. Now, there were several challenges to Germany in order to carry this out. Number one, Germany had no tradition of amphibious warfare from which to draw. Second, except for Norway, German troops had never landed on a foreign shore. And number three, for the invasion to work, the Germans would have to dominate the English Channel. But before that could happen, the Luftwaffe would have to dominate the airspace over the Channel, because whoever dominates the airspace really controls what happens on the ground. And given the fact that the Germans could not really execute a successful amphibious landing, Sea Lion was basically scrapped and canceled, and the prospect for knocking out Britain fell to the Luftwaffe alone. Next slide. In order for the Luftwaffe to be successful, they would have to gain control, as I mentioned, of the airspace over northwestern France, the Low Countries, and the Channel and southeastern England. Led by Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, the Luftwaffe would find itself hampered by five factors. Number one, they had suffered heavy losses during Fall Rot, Case Red, the invasion of France. Number two, the German Heinkel and Dornier bombers were obsolete. Number three, their crews lacked experience. Number four, although they possessed one of the greatest fighter aircraft, the Messerschmitt 109 or the ME or BF 109, that aircraft had a limited range. And number five, German aircraft production was really half of what Britain was able to turn out. Next slide. The RAF, or the Royal Air Force, held several advantages over the Luftwaffe. Number one, they had been building up their forces since 1937. Number two, thanks to the efforts of Air Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, the British had radar. Number three, the new Spitfire, British Spitfire fighter, was better than the ME 109. And number four, RAF aircraft simply flew deeper into England to avoid German fighter range. Next slide. Of course, this aircraft battle became known as the Battle of Britain, and it was fought in the skies over southern England in the fall and summer of 1940. The battle actually was coined from a speech that Winston Churchill gave to the House of Commons. Now, during the course of World War II, there were 23 separate Allied strategy conferences that were held. And for this course, we're only going to focus on 6 of the 23, so don't get nervous. I've included these conferences, not all 23, but the ones we're going to focus on in a handout that's in Canvas for you. So I would like you to reference that at this time, please. Next slide. Slide 35. One of the most controversial issues regarding Allied strategy during the war was the notorious Second Front controversy. And at the Second Washington Conference, held in the summer of 1942, Winston Churchill and President Roosevelt, sat down to discuss the opening of a second front in response to Stalin's demands that they do so. Now, both Churchill and Roosevelt were somewhat embarrassed because they knew that Stalin had been shouldering the lion's share of the fighting against the Nazis since 1941, when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, which we will discuss next module. Stalin had persistently insisted that Britain and America open up a second front by undertaking a cross-channel invasion of Nazi-occupied France as early as 1942. And if they agreed, this would force Hitler to divert troops from the Eastern Front fighting the Russians to confront this new front, this second front, thereby giving the Russians some breathing space and forcing Hitler into fighting a two-front war, which is exactly what the Germans had to do during the Great War. U.S. leaders shared Stalin's desire for a cross-channel assault, but the British, however, they preferred a more flexible approach, which was in line with their political objectives. You see, Churchill wanted to strike at what he called the, quote, soft underbelly of Europe, or Spain, southern France, Italy, and the Balkans. And this difference of opinion was reflective of how each nation viewed military strategy. Since the American Civil War, U.S. military leaders have focused on the belief that the chief aim of strategy is to annihilate the enemy's ground force. And if you study the Civil War, you'll know that General Ulysses S. Grant of the Union Army really epitomized this annihilation strategy. British leaders placed their weight on political and economic interests of enemy territory. And so this has been called the peripheral strategy, the British strategy, the peripheral one, as opposed to the American direct strategy. So in keeping with this preference for a peripheral strategy, Churchill raised the idea of an Allied landing in French North Africa during the Arcadia Conference, called Operation Gymnast. And in the weeks following that conference, U.S. military leaders grew increasingly skeptical of Churchill's idea. Therefore, American leaders proposed an alternate plan in March of 1942 that called for a massive Allied buildup in England prior to a cross-channel invasion in the spring of 1943. And this was called Operation Roundup. The British didn't approve of Roundup because they didn't believe that the Americans were strong enough to undertake such an operation as early as 1942. And as it turns out, the British were correct in that. Churchill met with Roosevelt at the Second Washington Conference and insisted that President Roosevelt, shelve the plans for a cross-channel operation for 1942. And in its place, Churchill urged a return to his proposal for a combined Allied landing in French North Africa. And for weeks, President Roosevelt tossed this around and finally agreed to postpone the cross-channel invasion, and instead agreed with Churchill to land U.S. forces in French North Africa. And this became Operation Gymnast, eventually morphed into Operation Torch. I'm going to stop there. We're at about 33 minutes, and I'll finish this with part 2 of Module 2.